right. Hello, everyone. My name is Sapphira Waymeyer, and today I'm going to be showing you my presentation. The title of the presentation is Bridging Traditions and Technology, Reinventing Church Outreach for Modern Times. This is written for the senior seminar for Life Pacific University for Professor Dorothy Kropf. This is the thesis for my capstone project and paper. I want to go over the gap. I want to focus on the gap between where community outreach and missions is and where it would be, where the field dictates that it needs to be. This is an approach that has been used by multiple leaders in Christian missions and within the Foursquare denomination as well. I would like to recommend at the end of this presentation a shift in the strategy of churches that desire to be involved in outreach and missions, more of a shift in focus, a shift in what is the outreach and mission team setting out to do and why. Here we have the first literature review slide. This is on the internal problems in the American church, which are taking away the focus a bit, taking up some of the focus. The three issues that I cover in this project are dropping attendance, addressing the LGBTQ community, and the issue of sexual misconduct and abuse within the church. For dropping attendance, I have two resources. One is a paper. One is an article written by David Roach in Christianity Today. He goes over the statistics and some of the research that has been done for why church attendance has dropped in certain generations. Then there's the statistical analysis, which I use from Pew Research Center. This report was published in September of 2022, and it outlines the research over the last 100 years and then begins to predict into the future what will happen if there is no change. Second is the addressing the LGBTQ community. The case study I chose for this is the United Methodist Church denomination split. Kate Shelnut and Daniel Silliman wrote a piece in Christianity Today on why, just on the whole news story, the whole issue of the United Methodist Church, and just giving the details on that case. And then the reason for why there are widespread concerns within the American church. There was a bill passed in 2022 in Canada banning conversion therapy, and several states within the U.S. have tried and succeeded in passing similar laws, which has raised concern within the church. It has caused church leaders to begin to focus inward on what they need to do to prepare for this and similar laws coming into effect. And then lastly, we have the issue of sexual misconduct and abuse within the church. The case study I chose for that was the Southern Baptist Church scandal, which was uncovered and published by the Houston Chronicle. It was a huge news story back in 2019 and again in 2022 when findings were released and republished by the Southern Baptist Convention itself. This showed an issue within the Southern Baptist Church. There's also widespread concern across Protestant churches throughout the U.S. Andrew Denny wrote a piece, a doctoral essay, which is published in the Qualitative Criminology Journal on the issue of child sex abusers and other sexual misconduct, which is statistics across Protestant churches. He compares this to the issue in the early 2000s with the Catholic Church. And then there is a book that I reference written by Neil Wiseman and H.B. London Jr. on their interview with Dr. James Dobson. And that book just outlines why pastors are at a greater risk and some of the statistics of what kind of risks the leadership is under. What kind of risks leadership is under within the American church in the area of sexual misconduct and abuse. Next, we have the models of ministry section. Next, we have the models of ministry section of my literature review. There's three main categories here. First off is the way things are, the need for change, and future recommendations. In this, the three main resources that I draw from is my interview with a colleague. His father is a national missionary in India. Is a colleague of mine who I interviewed on what's going on in the field and what does the field need in his area. This is also represented in Dr. Ray Davis from the International Mission Board, his article on missions history, and Dr. Ray Wheeler from our very own Life Pacific University, his article posted in Academia, developing a proactive, field-driven approach to short-term mission teams. These two also I draw heavily from in both the way current models exist and future recommendations. Also, Dr. Ray Davis provides a overview of missions history, which leads over into my examples of missionaries leading change in history. Two main ones that I focus on are Bruce Olson and Hudson Taylor. So there's 2 points there, 2 resources there on how they help to spark and lead change within their time era. And then lastly, I have the resistance to change and how to address it. This was a resource Todd Bolsinger wrote, Tempered Resilience. And in this book, this reference, I use, let's redo that. Then lastly, I have resistance to change and how to address it. This is just going over, Bolsinger goes over the issue of sabotage and why creating and leading change, even when it's necessary, is very difficult in the best of circumstances, and just some tips and tricks on how to implement the changes which are necessary. All right, we're going to jump into the contributing factors for the gap in missions. First, we have the internal problems, which I've already mentioned, the Southern Baptist Church sex abuse scandal, the United Methodist Church LGBTQ response, and the shift away from positive affiliation with Christianity. This shift has led to declining Christianity and also shows a loss of impact. I also touch on the changing world and resistance to change. What is it that has changed over the last 40 years, and why and how the church has resisted it? And then how can we forget the global pandemic of 2020, which has had lasting impacts on especially on the mission field. First up, we have the internal problems. The Southern Baptist Convention sex abuse scandal case study in the Southern Baptist Church in 2019. Houston Chronicle released a full investigation, which was done, which showed that church leaders were made aware that they had sexual predators moving from church to church as pastors, as youth leaders, as children's church managers, and church leaders turned a blind eye. They looked the other way. Some of them actually condemned the women who were coming forward and the youth who were coming forward and saying there's a problem here, and silenced them from going to proper authorities to handle this. The widespread concern then from this is, what about the safety of children and youth in the church? This is a question which is being addressed by lawmakers. It's being addressed by church leaders. It's being addressed by denomination leaders. How do churches and church leadership focus on outreach and ministry when they need to be taking care of the internal issues that have been allowed to fester with sexual misconduct within the churches? Then, secondly, we have the United Methodist Church denomination split over LGBTQ issues. The United Methodist Church had a denomination meeting in 2019 in which they voted to allow LGBTQ members who identify with the LGBTQ movement to join the church, to become members of clergy, and for LGBTQ type weddings to be hosted within the church. Also in 2022, we had the bill which was passed in Canada, the C4 bill, which subsequent bills were also passed within individual states in the U.S., providing concern over how churches decide to address and incorporate or not incorporate the LGBTQ community in their churches. And then lastly, there was the issue of dropping percentages of self-identifying Christians in America, dropping attendance, dropping just an overall loss of impact of Christians within the culture of America. The shift is moving away from positive affiliations with Christianity, which makes it more challenging in some ways for the church to have a positive impact. The widespread concern then with that is that leaders are then focusing inwards on how to boost attendance, how to create engagement. So all three of these issues affect outreach and missions in the following ways. They provide increased suspicion from the community outside Christianity. They give a poor reputation of Christians. This especially applies to the sexual abuse and misconduct allegations and cases within the church. This poor reputation then leads to combative responses from the outside and accusations of hypocrisy from people who are outside the church who we're trying to reach out to, and people on the mission field. American missionaries struggle to have an impact in other countries as well because of these issues that we face on the home front. And then one thing I did not include on the slide, but also is a major issue, is that all of these things, these issues on the home front, are causing leaders to not be focused on their outreach, on their missions. Leaders are more focused on dealing with issues at home, as they should. However, it takes away from the ability for them to focus on outreach and missions. And we'll get into that a little bit later on exactly how this has impacted the mission field. This is the slide on declining Christianity. Here on the left, we have the chart from Pew Research Center, which shows how Christianity has dropped within the US over the past 50 years or so. Really, over the last 30, you can see a significant drop, and this coincides with the technology boom. We're going to get into that just a little bit later. This decline impacts outreach and missions in the following ways. With less Christians and less people who are sympathetic to Christian causes, there is a lower donation rate, which means lower finances. There's less resources. It also means there are less Christians who are engaged, less people who are engaged in outreach and missions. It also turns the leadership focus away from reaching out to trying to figure out why their churches are shrinking and trying to boost attendance. This slide, we have the changing world, and how is this changing world impacting missions? Okay, 40 years ago, the year was 1985. In 1985, there was no internet. There was no cell phones. There was no text messaging. There was the way that they did things in 40 years ago to now has changed so dramatically. Talk to anyone who has lived through that change and they will tell you. However, the church has not. I'm speaking broadly here. I'm painting with a very broad brush because many churches have incorporated changes. Some churches have incorporated a lot of changes. Crazy changes. Are you kidding me? I'm painting with a very broad brush here because churches have varied responses to the changing culture. There are some churches which still sing the same songs that they sung in 1985, and they will not incorporate new ones. Then you have other churches who run their church like a concert or like a movie theater, any other secular gathering, and you have a broad range in between. But overall, there has been a marked resistance to change, especially within more traditional and conservative churches. This has led to a lack, the world around has changed, but the mission and outreach models of the American church still look very much the same. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we need to go in overhaul mode and start acting just like everybody else in the world. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying here is that change in the culture requires a change in the way you approach it, the way people interact with one another. Bolsinger's book, Tempered Resilience, describes the sabotage that leaders will face in navigating leadership through these changes. A quote from his book, The Definition of Sabotage: "It is not the bad things evil people do. It is the human things normal people do because they fear the loss that comes with change. They fear losing a way of living. They fear losing a way of operating. They fear losing something that works, that used to work. There's a fear of losing the anointing or the blessing of God in some cases, in some places. And so Christian leaders who try to make these necessary changes will face sabotage, Bolsinger says. It is only a matter of time. So this resistance to change within churches, within denominations, has made it very difficult for outreach and ministry models within the American church to change to match the world that has so dramatically shifted over the last 40 years. Lastly, we have post-pandemic impacts. Who wants to talk about COVID? So nobody is forgetting and nobody wants to go back. But in 2020, who remembers the lockdowns? All churches, every outreach, everything was locked down in some form or fashion. Now, not everyone honored the rules. We know there were churches that continued to meet. There were evangelists who still went out. But on the whole, the American church screeched to a halt. The global church screeched to a halt and was scrambling to find solutions. This pandemic hit missionaries especially hard. The economic impacts of the pandemic caused missionaries, many missionaries, to lose their financial support from the home church. The lockdowns hindered all their ministry efforts within the churches and areas that they were in, and international travel was halted. This meant that some missionaries had to leave the field abruptly. You're gone. Go home. Some of them were stuck where they were at. They decided, no, we're not going to leave, and we're stranded. One missionary friend who I know, her ministry was in one country in South Asia, and her parents and sister were in another area in South Asia, and her father actually caught COVID and passed away, and she was not even able to attend his funeral because lockdowns were so severe. There was no way for her to travel, and it was a very short trip. This pandemic sent a shockwave through the church, but more importantly, it sent a shockwave through missions. Since the pandemic began in 2020, very little information has been gathered or published concerning U.S. missionaries overseas. However, there has been one noted shift. More international missionaries are now being sent from the global south. That means south of the equator, so South America, Australia, South Africa, African nations are beginning to send more missionaries out. The numbers that I saw were not conclusive, whether it was more missionaries than the Western nations are sending, or whether it was just more than usual for the global south, but there has been a marked increase. Lastly, the estimates by Lifeway Research show that attendance in 2024, last year, for U.S. churches was only 60% of pre-pandemic numbers. Now, that included online attendance. So in-person attendance is actually much, much lower than it was pre-pandemic across the U.S. So to recap, we had the contributing factors were internal problems that are diverting the church's attention away from outreach and missions. We have the declining Christianity piece, which means that there are less people engaged, lower financial donations, and less focus because the focus is being turned towards attendance. And then the changing world and resistance to change, the major changes over the past 40 years in technology, communication, and culture, and how the church has not been consistent in its model of matching that change. And then lastly, the global pandemic's effects on the mission field. So now we're going to transition into the actual models of outreach and missions. History, what's going on in the present, and recommendations for a shift of focus and models in the future. First, we have the current model, which is mostly sending church focused. The current model I was a part of one of these short-term mission teams that went to visit my best friend's family in Ghana, in West Africa. The stateside supporting church determines how the church in the mission field will operate and coordinates these like short-term trips and teams, coordinates all the resources, provides the financial support. In the trip that I went on, the home church sent a 12-day mission team, short-term 12 days of maybe around 18 or 20 young people and 2 leaders. And the entire program was dictated by the supporting church. It was a modified version of like a youth group kind of activities and a bit of like exactly how the church based in Memphis, Tennessee would operate. So that included their worship models. The church in Ghana, in West Africa, they sang worship songs which were translated, but they were exactly the same hymns and worship songs that the church in Memphis, Tennessee also sang. We'll get into a little bit of why that's a bit of a gap that needs to be filled. Okay, so Ray Davis from the International Mission Board published an article back in 2017 outlining the 4 eras of modern missions. So we have number 1 was to the coastlands. This would have been like William Carey. Number 2 was to the interior. Hudson Taylor was a major player in moving the focus of missionaries from where they had already established to moving inwards and finding people in where they lived. Then you had number 3, to every people. This was a push that was largely in the late 1800s to mid 1900s. There was a transition that was looking for the unreached people groups. A major missionary that you could point to in this era would be Jim and Elizabeth Elliot, reaching to what was that tribe called? The Auca Indians, the Waorani. I believe that was the 1950s when Elizabeth Elliot and Jim Elliot went to Ecuador. Looking forward, Ray Davis points to another shift in the modern missions era that is by every disciple. So we're going to break this down just a little bit. The to every people, there's been a large push for the I'm sure anyone who has been part of missions or has heard about missions has heard of the 1040 window and the unreached people groups. There was a large push for missionaries to reach the unreached. This was the to every people section. But Davis points to a shift which is coming, which I believe, which this gap that I see, the need for it to be by every disciple, not the international missionaries working to reach every people, but it's being intentional about discipleship, discipling where you are, and then those disciples going and spreading the gospel and creating more disciples and creating more disciples. This is a shift from, I like to put it this way, it's a shift from the Billy Graham era, where Billy Graham was the speaker and he would go into any country and bring thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people would come to his crusades. This is an unnamed movement, and I'm not the first one to point to this. Dr. Ray Wheeler and other has pointed to it in his published work, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. There's also many pastors and leaders, we also see this evidenced in countries around the world, but this idea that the next revival, the next era of modern missions, the next real awakening is not going to be by, Jonathan Edwards or Billy Graham or William Carey. It's going to be by every disciple. It's a movement that there's not a name or a face to it, but it begins to spread by every disciple. So historical examples of missionaries who kind of saw the need for a shift in their time and began to pioneer the model which they saw needed to come into effect. First off is Hudson Taylor, that shift from the first to second era, if you remember from the last slide, from the coastlands to the interior. Hudson Taylor was one of the first missionaries who adopted the culture of the nation he was working in. He saw that the people that he was working with, the missionaries that he was working with, was just trying to make the Chinese people dress and act and talk like Englishmen. And he called them out on it. He said, no way. This is not the way. This is not the gospel. So he resigned from his place on the missionary team. He went out into the community, he grew out his hair, and he began to wear the traditional Chinese dress. And he began to reach people on the interior because there was already missionaries on the coastlands, and he was clashing with those missionaries on the coastlands. So he moved inland. He was like, okay, you guys got this. And he moved inland and began to reach people within the country, not just the areas where English people already were. And then the second one, from the second to third era, this is just one example that I know of that I can speak to extensively, is Bruce Olson. He wrote the book called Bruchko, which was last reprinted in 2006. But Bruchko, he had no missionary organization. He had no funding. He had no training, but he went out on the field and he said, I want to reach people who have not been reached. I want to reach areas. I want to speak to people who have not been spoken to. And a burning came into his heart. He began to hear about, when he was there in Colombia, he began to hear about how there were tribes of Native Americans there who had never even been spoken to. The only contact had been through arrows, through them shooting arrows and killing any white settlers that were trying to do anything in their territory. So this burning came into his heart, and he began to go to he began his journey to go to them. And so the entire book is just about his journey of facing the challenges, because he tried to join missionary groups and teams. And like Hudson Taylor, he ran into the fact that they were simply trying to westernize. They were not just bringing the gospel, they were also bringing American culture or Spanish culture or whatever culture that they wanted to bring in and exemplify, and they were not preaching the actual gospel. So these two missionaries are historical examples of how, for one, Hudson Taylor left and started his own ministry, and Bruce Olson never joined one, but he had followed this burning in his heart, and an entire Native American tribe was turned to the Lord. And it's amazing stories. So we can look at these examples for how to lead change in the current transition that leaders believe is happening right now between the era of to every people and the era of by every disciple. So looking forward, here are my recommendations for the end and conclusion of this paper. Focus on staying field driven. shift the focus of outreaches to the field dictated needs. This is something that I learned in my studies at Summit International School of Ministry. This is also something that Dr. Ray Wheeler talks about in his essay of just focusing on the needs of the people that you are serving. The reason we do missions should not be primarily to develop our youth or to raise awareness or to do any other thing. The focus of international missions and outreaches, the focus of anything outward, the focus of it should be on what you are reaching to. If the focus of what you're doing is not on what is being done, but it's on any other thing, then it will begin to decline. Secondly, to allocate resources and join where God is already moving. This is something that I learned from Dr. Daniel Sheard at Summit International School of Ministry. Begin to put the focus, when you're focusing outward on the needs of the field, look for some places where God is already showing signs. Like, it doesn't have to be where there's already success, but it's somewhere that God is already moving. There's a special thing that happens when the Spirit of God is on something. And learning to be sensitive as a leader, as an outreach leader, as a pastor, as a missionary, as a mission team leader, to be sensitive to say, I see that the Lord is working here, and I want to put the time and the resources into specifically this ministry. That leads into clearly defining the focal area of ministry. Clearly understand this team, what does it do? Right now, I lead a team that does a service every other week at a local retirement home facility, nursing home. And the focus of this ministry is to encourage the Christian community at the nursing home and to bring the gospel to them, to bring and to encourage them that there are young people who are still able and willing to come and speak to them and who are still following and on fire for God, to provide a way that they can then be involved in our lives. They can speak to us. They can pray for us. The focus is on providing a service and a community of Christians for them. So then the adequate, in that focus, there needs to be adequate training for leaders and for missionaries and for team members in their target fields. If you are taking a trip to New York City, you're not going to just take a bunch of random Pennsylvania teenagers and drop them on a New York street. That would be a disaster. You have to teach them what is New York like. You have to show them there are this and this and this. There is risks of drug exposure. There are homeless people. There are drugs around. There are people who are like thieves and pickpockets. So understanding to spot out the dangers, understanding to know what's the difference of culture. You don't like run around and just start like blabbering at everybody. That's not going to be very effective, because in New York, everybody's like eyes ahead and anybody can be literally doing anything. You could parade an elephant down the street and I don't think half the people on the sidewalk would notice. So the Pennsylvania teenagers are going to have to be shown this is how you talk to people on a New York street. Okay. And that's just someone going 2 hours within their own country. When you're going to another country, when you are leaving your home environment and going somewhere where the culture is completely different, where the language is completely different, where the ministry model, where the way people interact with each other in general is completely different, then there has to be an adequate amount of training for people to be prepared for what they're going to see, the changes that they're going to see in that target field. So staying field driven, that is a very key point. Secondly, is the courage to lead change. This is specifically for any mission leaders, any outreach leaders, needing to build the resilience to face sabotage with grace and strength. This is something that Ted Bolsinger goes on extensively. He covers extensively in his book, Tempered Resilience. He calls the process tempering, which, like a blade, it doesn't just get made and then sharpened. It gets heated and cooled and heated and cooled and beaten on an anvil and heated and cooled and beaten and heated. And there's a whole process that tempers a blade so that it's not just sharp, but it's also strong and flexible. It doesn't simply serve its purpose, but it also is able to withstand the circumstances that it needs to withstand in its purpose. And leaders are going to have to build that resilience to face the sabotage that they're going to face with grace and strength. Then, secondly, leaders need to learn and be able to analyze resources that are available and analyze the needs in the field to allocate the time and the resources efficiently and effectively. You can't, as a leader, leaders need to be able to allocate time and resources effectively. You need to be able to see who do you have within your church, who is on your team, who can you delegate, who can you say, this person is going to play guitar, this person is going to share a word, this person is going to maybe this person is a very good evangelist, so you would not necessarily how can you allocate your people? How do you focus on, first off, what are the needs? For me, in leading the team that is going to the retirement home, I need people who can sing. I need people who are willing to go and sit with and talk to older people. I need people who are not wanting to rush around and hurry. I need people who their Sunday afternoon is not, they're willing to sacrifice their Sunday afternoon to encourage someone else. I have been part of this team for 4 years now, and I've been leading it, fully leading it for 1, but helping to lead it for 3. And I have seen over the 4 years that this team has been together, I have seen the available resources. We have different vehicles. The available resources poured into this team, into this ministry. But the need was not for 30 people to go and overwhelm the 15 elderly that were coming for a random Sunday. Half of the 30 people that showed up just wanted to go to the grocery store, but because we were going to stop at the grocery store afterwards, they just decided to come along, and then they did not want to sit with and talk to the older people. They thought that the way that they were acting was creepy or wrong or misbehaving. They didn't understand. They weren't prepared. It was too big of a team for the leaders to prepare them for, this is how this or that happens or interactions that will occur. So the time that it took, the fuel, the amount of people that were tied up doing that outreach did not have a great impact at that time. It was not impactful and effective. It was actually very overwhelming. When me and a friend of mine took over leading it, 2 years ago, we started to focus on bringing people who have a heart for the elderly and who are willing to sit with them and talk. A big portion of what we do is about 30 or even 45 minutes after the service, we just sit and talk with them. We just listen to their stories, they've told 3 times today and 3 times 2 weeks ago and 3 times. Like, you listen again and you speak encouragement and you speak um, love and you speak life into these people who are in their last years. This focus, in analyzing the resources, we have buses, we have vans, we have all kinds of students and people and time. But when is the best? Who going is best? And how does this resource impact? How do you see it helping or hitting the goal of the focal area? And that is something that leaders need to be able to analyze and allocate them effectively. And then lastly is adjusting to recent culture shifts. This is especially needed in outreaches and in missions teams that are going to more urban places, but it is applicable anywhere. Recent culture shifts, you have to be aware of them. You don't have to act like them, but you need to be aware of them. One major example that I can give is brain rot. You would be surprised what adults and teenagers and middle schoolers all alike will say to you to whatever, get your responses, whatever. But if you can reach in there and be like, yeah, I know what you're saying, but here, let me relate it to you back. The impact that you will have when you can reach into the culture and you can say, yes, but I have something different. I have the gospel. The impact is the Holy Spirit can then begin to move. It cuts people to the heart because it begins to relate to them. So adjusting to culture shifts is something that leaders are going to have to be able to approach with wisdom and clarity and understanding. Because there's a right way to do it and there's a clear wrong way to engage in culture shifts as well. And we need to be watchful and prayerful and mindful and spirit-led. All right, and lastly is the discipleship of national missionaries. I think this is a major, major point. That era shift between to every people group to by every disciple. The current outreach model, the current missionary model, is that people from my church are going to go into the area, into the place, and they're going to do X, Y, Z. The forward-looking model, and I've spoken to several leaders on this. This is something that Dr. Ray Wheeler also included in his piece. So something also that Max Stiles and Stroop, the focus needing to be on looking for how do we disciple the people who are in our church so that they can then go out and begin to disciple others who are outside our church, who are, and not trying to keep like, look at what we are doing. No, it's what God is doing. The focus, God is doing it. But in looking at international missions, the example that I can give is my colleague, Gene Bhadavath. His dad is a traveling minister within the country of India, and he will go from city to city, and he will send word ahead of time. Hey, I'm coming to do a seminar. I'm coming to do a teaching for any Christian leaders, pastors, spread the word. And he will go and he will have a day, maybe a week. He will just begin to open the scriptures, begin to lay down a foundation, a doctrinal foundation for these hungry youth, and just begin to pour into their lives, begin to set them up with people who can be around them, begin to connect them with more mature leaders in their areas, and then begin to send them out. And then they go into the towns, into the villages, into the cities where even he cannot go to spread the gospel and say, this is how you share the word of God. This is how you bring life into your community. And this model is something that we can do across the board. This is not just a missionary model. This is also an outreach model domestically, that you begin to shift the focus. And this is the key point here. This is the key point of the essay. Shift the focus to discipleship. Shift the focus to buy every disciple. Use foreign or international or outreach, use bringing in other people as a support, use it as a training, use it for laying down solid doctrine for local ministries, for local people, for the in our community, for the pastor to be encouraged at our local retirement home so that he can be encouraged and then begin to go into the memory care facility that my team can't go in there every other week. That area is closed off, and on the weekends they're understaffed. They can't bring in and out a bunch of people from that section of the building. But on a Wednesday, Pastor Tom can take his team of Christians that already live in that building and go in to the memory care facility and begin to encourage them and to exhort them and to bring the gospel to some of them who've never heard it or who have walked away or forgotten what it means to be a Christian. And this model can be that's how it is applied in my life, in my circumstance, but it's this way. It can be in anywhere. It can be applied in your church. It can be applied in the church that a team from Summit International School of Ministry went to Latvia, and we just began to support where ministries were already moving, but they didn't have the resources or the encouragement or the finances or the people to do what they felt God had put on their hearts to do. So beginning to empower each and every disciple to then reach out as a missionary, that is the shift in focus that needs to be most profoundly, most communicated and applied in the current mission and outreach field. All right. So that brings us to a conclusion. So in conclusion, we know that there is a clear need for a modified approach in Christian outreach and missions, and that there are many internal challenges that church leaders face within their own organizations, within their own denominations. We see specific ones within American churches and organizations. these that must be faced, that must be taken on to effectively make changes. But it is possible for change. There are clear and exemplified models of missions and outreach work that shift the focus, that allow missionary, and outreach strategies to become more impactful and more effective in the communities that they're going on. Creating those clear focuses and shifting the focus off of what does our church need into what does the field need. And I just want to leave you with a couple of encouragements and final thoughts. Summit International School of Ministry, I am an alumni from there. They partner with Life Pacific University, and among alumni, among the people that we stay in contact with here at Summit, there are movements and missionary organizations that follow this model beginning to spring up in countries around the world. I referenced my colleague, his father's ministry in India. A classmate and dear friend of mine in Pakistan has begun doing a very similar thing and is requesting prayers there. Pastor Peter Namalia in Central Africa has begun building ministry schools for young pastors and ministers to come from all over Africa and then be sent back out as national missionaries to their own churches. Many of these organizations are not, there's no trace of them on the internet because of how sensitive it is in the areas where they are. They're heavily monitored areas. There's nothing on the internet. You're not going to find anything about these organizations, these movements, but you will hear about them. We'll hear about them beginning to have an impact. In Iran, you will hear about them. There will be flashes. There have been things that you will see, but there's a lot of things that are not able to be seen. And I think one final encouragement that I read in my research was it can be so big to look at the entire world and say, this whole shift needs to happen throughout the whole world. And what are we going to do? How is one person going to make this change? And the answer is you can't. I can't. No one leader can make the change. But begin to focus on that area where you do have impact. Begin to focus on that one outreach, that one part of your church where what is the focus? We're not really sure. No, begin to double down, begin to see what is the focus? How can we focus better on impacting the people that we're serving, whether that's the children in the daycare or the nursery, or as a worship leader, how are you impacting your team? How is your worship leading and impacting the church that you work and live in? Just begin to make one move where you are. It's like the old story of the kid throwing starfishes back into the water from the beach. And he's like, well, the older guy comes and talks to him and he says, you can't possibly save all these starfish. What are you even doing? And he's like, well, I saved this one. It mattered for this one. And you just begin to focus on where do you have an impact, and realize that the whole point of this era, the whole thing, is that it isn't going to be a one person that rises up and leads the charge. It's every disciple discipling and spreading the gospel person to person. So thank you so much for listening. I know this one has been probably a lot longer than most of the capstone presentations, but I couldn't condense it any more than it already was. So here is just a bit of my information and the class information. And here is the bibliography in case you wanted to look up any of the resources that I referenced. All right. Have a blessed day. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this presentation.